Hey, good evening. I'm Tom Yamas in New York. We are coming to you live with an NBC News Now special report. Former President Donald Trump speaking from his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey, just hours after he pled not guilty to charges related to his handling of classified material. This is the first extended remarks we're hearing from Trump on camera since he was arraigned on 37 felony counts at the federal courthouse in downtown Miami. For the first time in depth, the former president is outlining what his defense may be. Let's take a listen to a portion of what he said just moments ago about being charged with the Espionage Act.
Papers, which just about every other president has done, is one of the most outrageous and vicious legal theories ever put forward in an American court of law. The Espionage Act has been used to go after traitors and spies. It has nothing to do with a former president legally keeping his own documents. As president, the law that applies to this case is not the Espionage Act, but very simply the Presidential Records Act, which is not even mentioned in this ridiculous 44-page indictment. Under the Presidential Records Act, which is civil, not criminal, I had every right to have these documents. The crucial legal precedent is laid out in the most important case ever on this subject, known as the Clinton Socks case. You know what that means? After leaving the White House, Bill Clinton kept 79 audio tapes in his sock drawer. They included discussions of U.S. military involvement in Haiti, discussions of U.S. foreign policy, both defense and offense, against Cuba, recordings of President Clinton's conversations with all of the many foreign leaders at the time. Think of that. Sensitive facts about trade negotiations taken from presidential briefings, discussions with the Secretary of State about conflict in Bosnia, and much, much more. Very big stuff. Not only was Bill Clinton never even considered for criminal prosecution based on the tapes he took, but when he was sued for them, he won the case. Judge Amy Berman Jackson's decision states, under the statutory scheme established by the Presidential Records Act, the decision to segregate personal materials from presidential records is made by the president during the president's term and in the president's sole discretion. You're surprised to hear that, aren't you? Any normal administration, even an opposing one, would consider that to be the end, but not the corrupt Biden administration. The Sox decision, as it's known, also states, quote, the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, does not have the authority to designate material as presidential records. I don't have the authority. NARA does not have the tapes in question, and NARA lacks any right, duty, or means to seize control of them. This is law. The president enjoys unconstrained authority to make decisions regarding the disposal of documents. That's unconstrained to make that decision. Neither the archivist nor Congress has the authority to veto the president's decision. The Presidential Records Act does not confer any mandatory or even discretionary authority on the archivist to classify records. Under the statute, this responsibility is left solely to the President of the United States. Think of that. That's the decision. Think of that. Now, just think of that. In other words, whatever documents a president decides to take with him, he has the right to do so. It's an absolute right. This is the law. And that is something that people have now seen, and it couldn't be more clear. They ought to drop this case immediately because they're destroying the country. And this is why no other president, even those who kept far more documents than I, has ever been even investigated, let alone charged with a crime. because the sham indictment put forward by the Biden administration included staged photographs of boxes at Mar-a-Lago. Many people have asked me why I had these boxes. Why did you want them? The answer, in addition to having every right under the Presidential Records Act, is that these boxes were containing all types of personal belongings, many, many things, shirts and shoes and everything. As can be seen in the picture where someone, not me, I wonder who it might have been, dumped one of the very neatly arranged boxes all over the floor. They were full of newspapers, press clippings, thousands of pictures, thousands and thousands of White House pictures. The White House photographers, some are with us today. They took so many pictures, and we saved all of them, and they were in those boxes. Clothing, memorabilia, and much, much more. I hadn't had a chance to go through all the boxes. It's a long, tedious job, takes a long time, which I was prepared to do, but I have a very busy life. I've had a very busy life. They make it more busy because you're always fighting. And under the Sox decision, there seemed to be no rush. I wasn't in a rush because that decision was a law. The other picture that was so vile, you remember that one? It was angry and corrupt, was the photo staged by the FBI. And those that raided Mar-a-Lago, they were putting documents all over the floor. Remember that famous picture? All over, said confidential, said presidential, said all sorts of things. And it was supposed to be there like it was that way when they raided. It wasn't that way. They put them there, took the picture, and released it illegally to the press. They took my medical records, my passport, my birth certificate, and apologized. They even brought a safecracker. This is a professional safecracker they brought into Mar-a-Lago. And they broke into my safe, and you know what they found? Nothing. There was nothing there.
We've just been listening to former President Trump speak at Bedminster tonight. This was just 4 hours after being arraigned in South Florida in a federal courthouse where he was charged with several federal crimes. And for the first time, we are hearing what President Trump's defense may be in federal court. Again, he's not a lawyer, but at least he's telling us where he may be going with this. And his biggest defense so far, saying these were all his records, that they were his personal records. And if he's guilty of anything, it's just being in a rush, and that's not criminal. I want to turn to NBC legal analyst Danny Savalas, who joins our panel tonight here in this special report. Danny, for the first time, we're hearing from the president, and he's talking about President Clinton and a Sox case, which was very different than what we have in this indictment right here. Explain to our viewers.
Yeah, very different. It's called the Clinton-Sox case generally. What happened was Judicial Watch found out that President Bill Clinton had given a bunch of interviews, and he had kept the tapes of these interviews while he was president, apparently in his sock drawer. So what Judicial Watch wanted the court to do was order NARA, order the archives to go out there and go get these records. And the court concluded that NARA didn't have an obligation to affirmatively go out there and get the records. And in so ruling, Judge Jackson did say essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, that the president, if the president is able to determine what is a presidential record, it follows that he can also determine what is a personal record. So there is some support for the idea that a president can decide what is presidential and what is personal. Now, at this point, I'm going to draw a large figurative wall. And that wall, that Maginot Line, whatever you want to call it, is the moment when Trump receives a subpoena, for example, when and if he starts engaging in acts of deception, concealment of documents. And in addition, these are not just presidential or personal records. These are now, we're talking about classified records or records that deal with NDI, National
And as you say that, I'm going to ask our director, Brett Holy, to put up some of the charges he's being charged with right now so our viewers can understand what you're talking about here, where that line is being drawn.
And so here's where Trump may have a point. Had this dispute remained on the front end in its inception, which was National Archives says, hey, we want our documents back. We think you have some documents. And Trump says, well, no, I disagree. I've made them mine. They're personal. If those were the only facts at issue in this case, Trump may have an argument. And in fact, I think there is something to that defense. I don't know that it's going to be successful. I think there's too much else. And those something else things are, for example, that the documents were classified. The documents involved national defense information, that there was a subpoena, and that Trump may have deceived the government. Here's the bottom line. Take all these records, forget them for the moment. Anytime a person, a civilian, lies to a federal agent, whether or not they're under oath, they commit a false statement crime, Section 1001, which Trump is which appears in this indictment. So forget presidential records, forget all of that, classified, everything else. Just lying to federal law enforcement, lying to a federal agent is a crime.
And even the story's a little murky here, right? Because I know the number one piece of evidence for you from the indictment, and we have a graphic of this too, was the conversation former President Trump had with the publisher of a book, along with some key staff members, where he's talking about a war plan. And he says this is classified, and then the staff gets a little nervous, and they say, oh, well, we may have to change that. He says, I can't change it. I'm not a president anymore. So clearly he understands what he's holding in his hand.
I'm so glad you bring that up, because factually that kind of seems similar to the Clinton interview situation, but it's totally different. The Clinton interview situation was an interview when he was president, and it was some tapes that he took home. There's no indication that it involved national secrets, top secret war plans, any of this incredibly sensitive material. So that's one prong that majorly distinguishes this from the Clinton Sox case, which, again, the Presidential Records Act deals with presidential versus personal records. This is much more complicated than that.
I do want to talk about this, so if we can also get to that picture. This right here, Brett, if we can hold it right here. So he's claiming that someone knocked this over. He's claiming, look, there's newspapers, there's all kinds of stuff, there's beautiful photos. I was in a rush. I'm a busy guy. I don't know what goes in these boxes. In this picture right here, the feds claim that you can see a redacted classified document there among those newspapers. Will that hold up in court, Danny? I was in a rush. I didn't know what was in the boxes.
Well, the fact that the boxes turned over is really just more color. It's the idea that, look how haphazardly these were stored. But make no mistake about it, I don't know nothing, and other people handle this for me are going to be major themes of Trump's defense. They have to be. That has got to be one element of his defense, which is, look, there were other people handling this. I wasn't as involved as you may think. One of Trump's chief defenses has always been ignorance. He uses it very well. He doesn't know stuff. That's for other eggheads to know. I just know the stuff I need. Punctuation, grammar, that's for nerds. What I know is what I know, and that's business, and text messaging and email, that's for other people. He has made a career out of not sending emails, not being accountable.
But will that keep him out of prison?
Oh, in this case, I mean, look, it has insulated him to date, but once you go smack up against the federal government, they don't get around. I mean, look at the indictment. They've talked to everybody that can provide them information. They've gotten all the communications. Yeah. They've gotten recordings. This is something that Trump just can't claim that I knew nothing at all if there's evidence that he did know stuff and may have directed people to remove documents, move boxes, and generally conceal and deceive. That's where the problem is. That takes it out of Presidential Records Act land.
Kristen Welker, Chief White House Correspondent. She joins us now. Kristen, I want to go to some reporting that happened inside the courthouse. Our Garrett Haake reported this, several other reporters who were in there, and they described a president who was very serious, somebody who was taking what was happening around him in a very serious manner. He never looked at the special counsel. He stayed quiet the entire time. And for someone who sort of likes to always be in control and does whatever he wants, he couldn't in that federal courthouse. And this speech is much different than what we heard after Manhattan. After Manhattan, he just came out very hard, typical Trump. Here he's actually trying to lay out a legal case. You've covered the president. You covered his campaign. How do you read what's happening tonight?
Well, I think, first of all, you're absolutely right to start with the reporting from what happened in court. I think that this is yet another moment where the president is absorbing the gravity of this moment, the gravity of the political threat and the legal threat to him. He was chastened to some extent in the New York indictment, but you're absolutely right. He was far more, I think, emboldened on that day. Here he's trying to make a real attempt, as you say, to lay out his defense. And also, Tom, to energize his base. I mean, you saw him. Where was his first step? He stopped after court. He went to this restaurant that is a very popular spot for politicians to stop, a Cuban-American location. And he basically said, you know, food for everyone on me. And so you're seeing that push and pull with the former president, where he knows that this is different. He knows these are federal charges, and yet he also sees the political opportunity here to energize his base. And what happened after New York, you saw his Republican challengers really rally around him. We are seeing a bit of a difference this time around, Tom. You are seeing Nikki Haley, for example, break with former President Trump and say these are serious allegations, although today she said she would potentially consider pardoning him. No surprise, Chris Christie has gone after him with an immense amount of force. Notably, former Vice President Mike Pence, his former vice president, tonight telling the Wall Street Journal, quote, "These are very serious allegations. I can't defend what's alleged, but the president is entitled to his day in court." So still trying to walk a fine line, but Tom dipping his toe just a tiny bit further into this water of joining the chorus of those who are starting to criticize.
We got a little bit of more news in. We understand that former President Trump just attacked the special counsel, Jack Smith. Let's listen to that.
The prosecutor in the case,
Mike, I'm going to...
I will call it our case, is a thug. I've named him Deranged Jack Smith. I wonder what his name used to be, Jack Smith. It sounds so innocent, doesn't it? Jack Smith. What's his name? Jack Smith. He's a very nice man. He's a behind-the-scenes guy, but his record is absolutely atrocious. He does political hit jobs.
I want to bring in Hallie Jackson. Now, we got out of that soundbite a little early, but Hallie, you got sort of the gist of where the president was going with this. Yeah. And it was interesting. Kristen touched upon this, right? We got the descriptions of the former president inside the courthouse, right? Somber, if you will, composed, not making a spectacle. As soon as the moment he gets out, he heads to, and we call it in Miami, Versailles. I know it's Versailles, but in Miami, that's what we call it. He holds court there, huge spot, seen all over the world, glad-handing, smiling, looking like someone who's not worried. And now we have him back in Bedminster. He's bringing up an old foe, the Clintons, talking about somehow that will help in his defense, and now going after the special counsel. I mean, he's playing with fire here, and we'll go back to Danny later about attacking the special counsel. But this is Trump Playbook 101.
And the fact that there isn't even a Donald Trump playbook as it relates to an indictment, Tom, I think is notable. You're looking at these images from Cafe Versailles, and you talk about, felt more like a victory lap than anything else. And this is just 12, 13, 14 minutes after he left the courthouse where he became the first ex-president to be arraigned on federal charges. They sang him happy birthday there. He said, "I'll buy everybody food," essentially. I mean, this was what we would see. I know you know this place well. I've been there for many a campaign trip. It is what you would see on the typical course of a candidate out in the stump. He is making a political play here, far more than a legal one. And that is what you're seeing in tonight's speech as well. Much of this is in some ways his Truth Social account come to life verbally here, because Donald Trump has been going after Jack Smith online now for days, if not longer, for weeks. So you are hearing, when he calls him deranged and a thug and all of these insults, you are hearing Donald Trump echo the attacks that he's been pushing all along. Think about what an interesting moment, though, Tom, in that courtroom. Not clear that Donald Trump knew that Jack Smith was in there, but the special counsel was not presenting for the prosecution, not speaking on behalf of his team, but they're present as I think the way that a lot of people see it, as a symbolic message that he has the back of the prosecutors who are bringing this case, the prosecutors under him, that he is there in a sort of show of united force for the Department of Justice against the attacks of Donald Trump. We heard that in the one time that we heard from Jack Smith himself when he delivered those remarks at the DOJ last week, when the word of the indictment first came out, when we first learned all of these, frankly, extraordinary details here, was Jack Smith backing up his people at the DOJ. That matters, Tom, because of the other political component, the political context here. You and Kristen have talked about it. The idea that there are many Republicans, when you look at polling, half of the Republican electorate, that has no faith, they say, in the Department of Justice, that sees this agency and the FBI in an unfavorable light. The shift that you are seeing from Republicans who are now attacking law enforcement, attacking the Department of Justice as weaponized, as politicized, is a shift away from the law and order mentality that Republicans had for a long time, Tom. So a lot of layers to this. I understand that the former president is also talking about Mike Pence, pointing out that Mike Pence was absolved of any issues related to the classified documents that he had in his possession. Keep in mind the key difference when you talk about any of these cases, when it's Mike Pence, when it's Joe Biden, and again, there's plenty of details we don't know still about the Biden case in particular, is the issue of cooperation, Tom. Danny can speak more to this, but when you look at the indictment, all of the counts, all of the charges come after January 20th. You're like, why do you care about January 20th? Remember what happened 3 days earlier. Walt Nauta handed over, Trump aides handed over 15 boxes of documents. Multiple legal experts have told our team that if Donald Trump had just handed over everything then, we wouldn't be here today, that this would be almost certain to not be an issue.
Yeah, Pence, of course, turning over the documents back, the main difference there. I want to bring in Gabe Gutierrez. He was outside the federal courthouse down in Miami. And Gabe, the former president sort of getting treated a little differently, probably because he's a president, probably because the entire world knows what he looks like. He's going to be able to keep his passport. He's going to be able to travel. He's going to be able to essentially campaign here. Somewhat unusual for someone who's been charged with federal crimes and high-profile federal crimes. But that's what the judge ruled on.
Yeah, that's right, Tom. Well, federal prosecutors said that they did not believe that the former president or his alleged co-conspirator were flight risks. And this is something that, yes, is certainly unusual. But again, this is a very unusual defendant. Now, I was in the courthouse today watching a video feed in the media overflow room of what was going on inside that courtroom. And as we heard from my colleague Garrett Hake, who is also inside the room, the former president was there, did not say a word during these proceedings, which is different, you may remember, Tom, from that arraignment in New York several months ago, where the former president did get up and utter the words "not guilty" himself. This time, his counsel, which is in that courtroom sketch, sitting to his right, Todd Blanche, he uttered those words, "not guilty." And I can tell you, Tom, hearing the former president inside that courtroom, or hearing the proceedings underway inside that courtroom with the former president sitting there with a scowl on his face, with his arms crossed, you could tell he didn't seem very happy to be there. But as other colleagues have mentioned, this was a situation where former President Donald Trump did not control. Now, it was incredible to see the special counsel, Jack Smith, just several feet from him in that first row, standing or sitting right behind his prosecutors. And also, Walter Nauta, the alleged co-conspirator here, former President Trump's body man, sitting to his right, just several feet from him as well. Should point out, Nauta was not officially arraigned today. He just had his first appearance. He was booked and processed, but he is now set to be formally arraigned and enter a plea later on this month. And Tom, it is just, if I can tell you a little bit about the scene here today, just a surreal atmosphere here at the federal courthouse here in South Florida. They were expecting, or law enforcement officials, I should say, were preparing for potentially large crowds. That did not materialize. There was one incident here as the motorcade was speeding away where a demonstrator was pushed aside from that motorcade as it was getting out of the courthouse here. But overall, no major security threat. There was no major clashes. Just a very bizarre scene here as the former president of the United States being arraigned on this sweeping 37-count indictment. Many questions right now as how this case plays out over the coming months. And again, just incredible to witness here as the former president left here, then went to that stop near Cafe Versailles, as you call it, before heading to New Jersey, Tom.
As I call it, as you call it. You're from Miami, too. All right, Gabe Gutierrez, we appreciate that. We understand the former president has just wrapped up his comments. We're going to check in with our correspondent, Vaughn Hilliard, who is there in Bedminster in just a moment. We're going to get him up and in front of a camera. But we do want to play one more soundbite because we know that Vice President Mike Pence is now running for the GOP nomination as well. And former President Trump just mentioned him. Let's listen in.
He totally exonerated Mike Pence. I'm happy about that. Mike did nothing wrong, but he happened to have classified documents in his house. But they exonerated him, and
So the former president there trying to draw a comparison, as we mentioned before, with him and the former vice president's case. Clearly not the same issue at all. Former Vice President Mike Pence, from what we know, has cooperated completely with federal authorities. Chris, I want to bring you back in this conversation because a lot of Republicans have pointed to President Biden, saying that he's been charged with similar, or he's being investigated, not charged yet. He's being investigated for similar crimes, and yet nothing has happened. But the cases are very differently. Though, clearly, President Biden and his staff were not forthcoming when they first started dealing with federal investigators. There were documents found in his garage. That's all true. But the case is still very different.
The case is very different. They were not forthcoming with the public. However, they were cooperating with investigators, according to law enforcement officials. What's happening right now is that there is a special counsel investigation into President Biden's handling of classified documents. But the biggest difference, Tom, is part of what Hallie was just talking about. Former President Trump was subpoenaed to turn over the documents, and he still didn't turn over the documents. In this case, President Biden complied with requests by investigators, opened up these various spaces so that they could come in, search them, get the documents, still under investigation. So we have to see what happens. But at this point, that's the critical difference. That's why Trump was charged.
Hallie, I want to go back over to you because now Republicans, and you touched upon this in your original comments, right, are trying to balance the line, right? And you have a gulf, I would argue. You have Chris Christie on one side of that gulf, and he is going hard into the former president, saying this is his fault, this is not prosecutors' fault. Then you have Nikki Haley, former governor of South Carolina, somewhere in the middle, starting to say if this is true, he shouldn't have done it. Then you have other people like Senator Tim Scott. Vice President Mike Pence, we're sort of hearing from him today. Governor DeSantis, who's the toughest competition for Trump, is attacking the Justice Department but not attacking Trump. It's sort of a strange line because I think everyone's trying to make that political calculation, right? Can we peel off some of the MAGA support and maybe win this nomination?
And when is the right time to, if they're going to go hard, do that, Tom? I like how you call it a gulf. I've been thinking of it as a kind of spectrum here, because it is a spectrum when you look at the way that the former president's rivals in the Republican race are talking about this. Yes, Chris Christie is absolutely on one end. He has staked, Tom, as you well know, his whole campaign on being the anti-Trump voice in the Republican Party. We are just hearing from Mike Pence, even late tonight, Tom, a new remarks to the Wall Street Journal in an editorial board meeting where he apparently said, I can't defend what Donald Trump did, but the former president deserves his day in court. This is to the Wall Street Journal ed board there. And again, as you talk about, it is, Pence has a unique perspective on this because of his own classified documents that were in his possession that he then handed back when asked. Then you have the other end of the spectrum, right? So you're right. Nikki Haley's sort of in the middle there because on the one hand, she says that if this indictment is true, she's talking about the substance of the allegations, it is incredibly reckless. But then she says today, well, I might maybe pardon Donald Trump if I got elected because I think that is what's best for the country. I'm paraphrasing here. Then on the other end of the spectrum, right, if Chris Christie is here, maybe Nikki Haley's here, here you've got House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, for example, one of the former president's most powerful allies in Congress, who essentially said, actually did say, well, bathroom doors lock, a reference, of course, to that photo of the classified documents in a bathroom at Mar-a-Lago that raised concern, of course, among national security experts. So it is a variety of responses from the GOP that I think fall in like three different buckets here. But the bottom line is this, and I'll tell you what I'm hearing behind the scenes from sources that I'm talking to at rival campaigns, that at this point, you have heard a lot of them echo his calls, echo his critiques of the Department of Justice, saying that it is weaponized, again, because that's where the Republican base is. The substance of the indictment is going to be the next piece of the puzzle here. You're hearing some of these candidates now come out and talk about how serious the allegations are, how concerning the allegations are as laid out in this indictment. When will they sharpen those attacks? Will it be before the first debate? Will it be, as I've heard from some, let's see what happens in Georgia, where Donald Trump is facing other legal issues, maybe a potential third indictment. We don't know if it happens. It would probably come down in early to mid-August. That is going to be a key point here because, if there is no sharpening of the attack line, if you will, then this is, at least for Donald Trump in the Republican primary, not an issue that's front and center in a way that is threatening to Donald Trump. Right now, he's owning this. As one Republican said to me, he is never stronger than when he is able to play the victim of political persecution, in his view.
And on that point, yeah, Hallie, it's a perfect setup for this next fight. What would former President Trump do if he's reelected? He just told us. Let's listen in.
I will appoint a real special prosecutor to go after the most corrupt president in the history of the United States of America, Joe Biden, and the entire Biden crime family. Name a special prosecutor. And all others involved with the destruction of our elections, our borders, and our country itself. They're destroying our country. And when I'm reelected, and we will get reelected, we have no choice. We're not going to have a country anymore. I will totally obliterate the deep state. We will obliterate the deep state.
Kristen Welker, it's sort of ironic here, right? He campaigned in 2016 on lock her up. He's now fighting for his innocence here and now saying he's going to go after Joe Biden as well. When Hallie was mentioning, you were signaling over to me that you want to kind of get in this conversation with the Republicans.
Well, and I think one of the key points, and Hallie raised this, will there be more indictments? And taking a step back from that, is there going to be a fatigue factor?
With voters?
Voters.
Yeah.
Will voters start to feel it? And will his Republican challengers start to raise this as a potential argument? I'm told there are discussions about this inside some of his competing campaigns, raising the issue that here he is, yet again, asking voters to fundraise for him around this issue, to defend him on this issue, instead of, they may argue, laying out what he's going to do for the American people. That's a potential vulnerability, Tom, particularly if there are more indictments. So we'll have to see what happens. But I think that's where the wagons are circling.
Danny, explain something to our viewers, because I read this. I want to make sure it's right. The president, former president, potentially has the ability in court to keep delaying this until after the election. Is that possible? He could keep filing motions to delay this even after 2024?
Yes, it is possible. Generally, in federal court, judges are not as inclined to let defendants delay as much as they are in state court. And that's really just a volume issue. State courts are absolutely packed with cases, so it's very easy. With one continuance, a case can get spun out for months and months and months. You're not going to get the same thing in federal court, but when you consider, and I'm anticipating, there are going to be a lot of motions filed by this defense for a couple different reasons. Number one, there are a lot of different evidentiary issues at play here. There are some suppression issues at play. For example, they'll try to suppress the tapes of or the communications by the lawyer. So there are a lot of different motions that are going to be filed. Those will all have the effect of delaying the case. And then there's just that intangible, because this is the most important federal criminal defendant in the history of our country. Yeah. Anytime that happens, you got to add time on, because unanticipated things are going to happen.
On that point, briefly, because I want to get over to Vaughn at Bedminster, why does the former president not have the greatest legal minds, the greatest legal scholars assembled, a la the O.J. Simpson dream team? He's a billionaire. He has the money. Well, why is it the sort of same cast of characters with lawyers, and why is he having trouble finding other lawyers?
Respectfully, I'm kind of an amateur OJ historian, and actually the dream team, when you look at it, wasn't as dreamy as you might imagine. And some of Trump's
they got the verdict,
but they got the,
yeah,
you're right, and exactly, sometimes a broken clock, right? Yeah. A couple times a day. But the point about this is that Trump does have good lawyers. Jim Trusty, Tim Parlatore, who are no longer on his team, really, really good federal criminal defense lawyers. They were a major loss to Trump now that they're no longer on his team. Trump is able to get good counsel, but here's the challenge for Trump. Number one, conflicts. Any reasonably sized law firm is going to have a conflict. If they've had any decent sized client, there's going to be a conflict between Trump and that client. So he's mostly going to be looking at smaller firms, maybe even solo practitioners, and then a lot of attorneys. I think about myself. If I received that phone call, and I doubt I ever would,
they just put your telephone number on the bank.
I know, I understand that, right. If I did, then I think a lot of lawyers' major concern is the legend of not getting paid, the conflict, the fact that he may turn on you later on and blame you for his problems. So, yeah, there are a lot of different reasons. Trump has had very, very able lawyers. It's a shame for him that he's lost them. I mentioned two of them that I think he really could have used right now that he no longer has in his arsenal. But
the most famous client in the world, but a very complicated one.
Yes, exactly right. Okay. Yes.
All right, Danny, thanks. I want to get to Vaughn Hilliard. He joins us now live from Bedminster, New Jersey. He was there for the entire speech, for the arrival and everything else. Vaughn, you've been covering Trump throughout this new campaign and speaking to Republican voters. Talk to me about what stood out for you tonight.
You know, for Donald Trump here, it's kind of deja vu from 2.5 months ago when instead of Bedminster, it was Mar-a-Lago after his hush money payment indictment in Manhattan. He flew back to Mar-a-Lago property and delivered a very similar speech in which he questioned the prosecutors bringing the cases against him, in this case, special counsel Jack Smith. But I think it's important to note, he didn't deny the obstruction here. He didn't deny the underlying facts that classified documents were at his Mar-a-Lago property. He didn't didn't deny the facts that he had essentially hid them from the Department of Justice that led to the raid. And so when you're looking at this from Donald Trump's standpoint, he had 3 of his legal team here and very much his message from the teleprompter was one that we should expect to see play out in the courtroom. And that was focused on the Clinton socks case here, which I will let Danny and others really be the ones to hone in more on. But Donald Trump makes claim that it was within his right in the final days of the White House to take whatever documents he wanted, and that they would therefore be personal records, not presidential records. But for him, there is a political angle to this, and he told this crowd that it is necessary that he wins the White House again. Of course, the necessity really stems from the reality that he could, if he were to be found guilty, face a potential prison sentence, and that extends much more into the political repercussions of somebody who is running for president of the United States at the same time as these legal proceedings are likely to take place.
Vaughn, a few hundred supporters there at Bedminster. Did you notice a change in his tone and his demeanor at all in delivering this speech versus what we heard after the Manhattan trial?
Not much, honestly. Somebody, an ally of his, that told me after that first indictment, she called it an indictment party, and this very much had similar vibes to it. It's a similar playlist. It feels like a rally to a certain extent, and largely that's because Donald Trump has been untouchable politically. I mean, ever since he was first arrested in Manhattan 2.5 months ago, his poll numbers, he has increased his lead over Ron DeSantis by double now, about 30 percentage points. And so for him and for his allies here, yes, there are going to be the legal hurdles, and they're not naive to that. But in real time, they see support continuing to work in their favor here, at least among the Republican electorate.
Vaughn Hilliard reporting for us from Bedminster. I want to thank our entire panel tonight, all of our reporters, Kristen Welker, Hallie Jackson, Gabe Gutierrez, the great Danny Savalos. We thank you all, the best reporters and analysts in this business. That concludes our special coverage of this historic evening. I'm Tom Yamas, and your
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.